Is this the future of mountain bike suspension forks? This is the Trust Shout. It's the second linkage fork from Trust Performance. It's aimed squarely at the enduro market. And as you can see, it does things very differently from the conventional telescopic forks we're used to seeing on bikes these days. It works a lot like the 4-bar rear suspension systems that we see on most bikes nowadays, but it's kind of shrunk down and obviously attached to a front fork. So why would you want to do that in the first place? Well, telescopic forks have a lot of friction, particularly when they're under load. And by using links with bearings as opposed to a telescopic fork, which has two parts that slide against one another, you can reduce friction significantly. In theory, this should benefit sensitivity. And while a telescopic fork is constrained to move in a straight line as the suspension compresses, this design affords its designers much more freedom over the axle path and other kinematics. In particular, this fork is designed to have something called anti-dive, so basically it uses the torque generated by the brake to resist a dive which would otherwise happen during braking. Now we should probably point out that this fork cost £1,900 in the UK or $1,975 in the US. A RockShox Lyrik, for example, cost £950, so it's literally twice the price. And obviously this is going to be a huge sticking point for a lot of people. But for the purposes of this review, what I'm really interested in finding out is whether it performs better than a telescopic fork. Similarly, I'm not going to comment too much on the aesthetics. As someone who's been described as the worst dressed man in mountain bike journalism, I'm in no position to comment. However, I will say that although it makes the bike look much slacker, the head angle is actually the same and the axle is in the same place when the fork is at rest as a telescopic fork. It's just that those legs are swept forward in order to make room for the links behind them in order to keep the axle in the same place. It's also worth pointing out that while the entire structure is made of carbon fiber, it is getting on for 200 grams heavier than an equivalent RockShox Lyrik or Fox 36. The Shout also isn't particularly easy to live with. You can't fit a proper under the crown mudguard. You've got two air springs, one in each leg, so it takes a bit longer to adjust the air pressure. And to add or remove volume spacers is like a half-an-hour job instead of a 30-second job. So there's some practicalities to be aware of, but as I say, really not a deal breaker. I think the main thing that differentiates how this fork performs compared to a telescopic fork is the difference in axle path. So a telescopic fork, the axle moves in a straight line where the angle is the same as the head angle. So if you have a 64-degree head angle, the axle will move up and back at 64 degrees. Whereas with the Shout, because of those short links, the axle moves in a really tightly curved arc, which starts out at around 30 degrees and ends up about vertical. First off, because the axle moves so far back in the beginning of the travel, it actually shortens the fork offset. So it goes from about 55 millimeters at the very start of the travel to about 25 millimeters by the middle of the travel. Whereas a conventional fork has probably about 42 or 51 millimeters of offset throughout the whole travel. Now, shorter offset gives you more trail, and that's the distance between the steering axis and the front contact patch. And generally speaking, more trail means that the steering feels heavier but more stable. It wants to self-center more and return to dead ahead whenever it's knocked offline. Trust says that the reason that they've designed the fork like this is because when the fork dives, so the fork compresses and the shock doesn't compress, the head angle gets steeper, and that means you have less trail and so less stable steering when you're on steep descents and you're braking hard. So they've designed it such that the offset gets shorter when that's happening, which gives you longer trail, so it compensates for that brake dive. However, it's not as simple as that, because a lot of the times the fork and shock compress together, and so the head angle doesn't change. So you're ending up with more trail in those situations. So it's not necessarily more consistent, it's just consistent in a different situation. But what I experienced when I first started riding this fork was that it seemed reluctant to tip into a corner, particularly when you're braking as you enter the corner. I think because that shorter offset relative to a telescopic fork means that you have more trail, and so you have much heavier steering, which kind of just wants to go straight on. To be honest, it never feels as willing to engage a turn as a conventional fork. The other main effect of that curved axle path is all to do with how it absorbs bumps. So because the axle path starts off very rearward and then becomes much more vertical, when you plow into a large square-edged bump, like if you ride headlong into a curb, it really sucks it up very impressively. There's much less feedback in that situation. And that's because when you ride into a square-edged bump, there's a large rearward component of the force, particularly when you first touch the bump. But then as you get over it, the force becomes more vertical. And so this axle path is perfect for absorbing those types of bumps. However, there is a downside, which is that very horizontal initial axle path means that the axle has to move a lot further before you really get any vertical displacement. And that means that if you hit a bump with a vertical force at the start of the travel, it's very hesitant and reluctant to really get going and get moving into its travel. And this causes a kind of harsh, jarring sensation. This is particularly noticeable when you land a jump to flat. That initial part of the axle path is very reluctant to get moving on those kind of touchdown impacts. Also, smaller bumps tend to move the axle in a more vertical direction, and the fork is very insensitive to those type of bumps at the beginning of the travel. It's quite harsh and jarring on those kind of small bump, chattery trails, and you really have to work hard to get the fork into its travel so that you get good traction on the front wheel and better sensitivity. However, because the axle path becomes more vertical towards the end of the travel, if you're loading the fork up and you hit a hole, it can sometimes really give way and kind of lurch through its travel in a way that I find really off-putting and quite unpredictable. On the other hand, it does stay very high in its travel under braking because of that anti-dive, which means that you have more travel in reserve when you're on a steep chute using a lot of front brake. However, I think this creates a bit of an unpredictable feeling because when you're braking, the fork feels quite firm and supportive, but when you hit a big hole, it kind of really lurches through the travel in quite an unpredictable, erratic fashion. The axle path has another weird quirk when it comes to hitting large bumps at slow speed. While a telescopic fork has, say, 51mm of offset all the way through the travel, this fork gets down to 25mm of offset by the middle of the travel. And that means that your front center is nearly 25mm or almost a frame size shorter by the time it gets halfway through its travel. And that shorter front center means you have more load on the front contact patch. And that seems to kind of pitch your weight forward sometimes, particularly on those slow speed square edged hits. Whereas, as I said earlier, if you hit a square edge bump at high speed, it really sucks it up nicely. Now, of course, everything about how a fork performs depends on setup. So I've tried adding low-speed compression and adding air pressure to try and get more mid-stroke support so that the fork stays higher and doesn't dive through its travel so readily. But those things make it harsher and less comfortable, which is another issue I've had with this fork. It's no good saying that one fork is harsher than another or more supportive than another. That can just be a difference in setup. When I've compared it to a RockShox Lyrik Ultimate, which I consider to be the best telescopic fork out there at the moment, I could quite easily find a setup that was simultaneously more supportive and therefore more predictable, but at the same time more comfortable and offering more traction, particularly near the start of the stroke. I've spent quite a lot of time over the last couple of months experimenting with air pressure, volume spacers, compression and rebound damping, and I've even had direct feedback and help from Trust Performance on helping me set this fork up. I've not been able to get it to be as good as a Lyrik on both of those metrics at the same time. Trust did say that they have not designed this fork with comfort as a primary priority. However, if I wanted to set up a RockShox Lyrik without really being too concerned about comfort, I could set it up really firm with lots of compression damping, and I could have a fork that was really, really supportive. So I don't think that argument really holds out. It's all about how much support you get for a given amount of comfort and traction. Admittedly, a telescopic fork will dive far more under braking, so you get a much bigger change of head angle and a far bigger change of trail when you apply the brakes. Although I can't be sure if I'm just more used to how a telescopic fork behaves under braking, or whether there is actually an advantage to that shortening of trail when you apply the brakes. And despite doing quite a huge amount of riding on this fork over the last couple of months, I've not got used to how it turns. I think that's partly because of that variable or more variable front center length and the variable fork offset, but I think it's also to do with lateral flex. This fork has a lot more lateral flex than a non-inverted conventional telescopic fork, which confounds that kind of cornering weirdness and makes it really hard to predict what the fork will do when you really stuff it into a berm. I have tried using a torque cap hub with this fork, which does seem to help, but I still don't think you have anything like the lateral stiffness that you get with a conventional fork. But whatever the reason, I couldn't get to a point where I could corner as aggressively and as confidently and as consistently on this fork than I can with a RockShox Lyrik, for example. Trust recommends running this fork with what feels like a very slow rebound speed. And while I have tried it fully open, I do think they're right in that I think it feels more settled and controlled and more predictable with a slower rebound and firmer compression damping too. However, even with the rebound set really slow, it still tops out when you really kind of wrench on the bars for a manual or a bunny hop. So on a trail where you're regularly having to sort of manual and hop over things, it feels both heavy and clunky to get the front wheel lofted over them. And that's really not something you want to be feeling on a $2,000 fork. When I was swapping back to a telescopic fork, I think partly because it's easier to manual over things, and partly because it has that shorter trail when you're braking, it feels more lively in certain situations. It's kind of more eager to turn into corners, more eager to lift over things, and I think that's a good thing. I have done some time testing on 2 different tracks with a Trust Shout and a RockShox Lyrik, and I was considerably faster on the Lyrik every time. I think the main reason for this is I just wasn't confident pushing this fork, particularly in the corners, and I think that is mostly where I was losing time. However, there was one test track which involves virtually no braking and no pedaling, and it's basically just a very long, rough straight. And I was consistently slower on the Trust fork, and it felt like what was happening was that every bump was robbing more momentum on this fork than on the Lyrik. It's like every bump was pushing me backwards a little bit more. There could be something else going on there, but I think it may be harder to carry speed through certain types of bumps on this fork when compared to the Lyrik. So a lot of this review comes down to the issue of getting used to something that's wildly different to what I've always ridden. So the question is this fork something you can get used to, a bit like driving on the other side of the road, or is it something you just learn to live with, like having a noisy neighbor? After spending over 2 months riding this fork and doing quite a lot of swapping back and forth between telescopic forks and the Shout, I have to conclude that it's the latter. To draw a more relevant analogy, I think it's a bit like with longer wheelbase bikes. They take a bit of time to really adapt your riding style so that you can get the most out of them. But in my experience, when you start riding them, you notice the benefits almost straight away. Whereas with this fork, I feel like I've been going out of my way to try and find the situations where it has an advantage. So is this the end of the road for Trust and for linkage forks in general? I really don't think so. I think that there's enough promise shown in the lack of brake dive and in the sensitivity to square edge tits in particular that I think there could be legs in the idea. I think if there was a stiffer chassis and maybe a slightly different axle path, you could have some of those benefits with less of the unpredictability, and I'd really like to try that. Although it'll be interesting to see if Trust would ever send me another fork to test. I think if they sorted out the lateral flex and maybe had a slightly different axle path, they could reap more of the benefits with less of the unpredictability. And it's worth bearing in mind that linkage forks for mountain bikes are still a pretty new concept, whereas telescopic forks have 25 years of R&D behind them. So maybe because of the inherent advantages that linkages promise, they might just be able to catch up and overtake in the years to come. Let us know in the comments if you think that linkage forks are something that interests you and if you think there might be something that you could see yourself buying in the future. And as always, don't forget to like and subscribe, and if you click the little bell icon, you'll be notified whenever we upload a new video.